The Grand Strategic Academy floated in the endless dark above the gas giant Thalrix, a massive orbital ring of metal and glass where the galaxy's brightest young soldiers came to learn the art of war. Cadets from over 40 species walked its corridors every day, each one selected from billions, each convinced they were destined for greatness. Among them was a human named Eli Morrow. He was 22 years old, born on Titan, raised in the cold tunnels beneath the ice, and he had a habit that annoyed almost everyone around him. He could not stop taking things apart. His datapad had been disassembled and rebuilt 3 times since the semester started, each time with small improvements that technically violated Academy regulations, but made the device run 30% faster. His uniform had modified pockets sewn into the lining, where he kept micro-tools, wire, a small soldering pen, and a thumb-sized piece of scrap metal he liked to fidget with during. Humanity had only been part of the Galactic Concord for 40 years, and most species still treated humans the way older siblings treated the baby of the family, with a mixture of amusement and mild concern. Eli had learned to ignore the looks. His closest friend at the Academy was a Kethri named Tyrus Vel, an insectoid about Eli's height, with iridescent wings folded tightly against their back, and large compound eyes that reflected light like gemstones. Tyrus was a genius at theory and strategy, capable of running complex battle simulations in their head faster than most computers. But they had a problem. They were terrified of actual combat. "I joined the Academy to prevent wars, not fight them," Tyrus had once confessed to Eli over synthetic coffee in the mess hall. Eli had simply nodded and said, "Fair enough." They made an odd pair, the anxious insectoid and the quiet human tinkerer, but they understood each other in the way that outsiders often do. On the other end of the social spectrum was Cadet Sorvon, a Gorvathi noble who stood nearly 8 feet tall and was covered in thick emerald scales that gleamed under the station lights. Sorvon was the top-ranked cadet in their year, a born warrior from a species that had been waging interstellar war since before humans had discovered fire. He was proud and loud about it. He had a particular talent for making humans feel small, not through cruelty exactly, but through a casual dismissiveness that suggested he genuinely believed humans were a temporary novelty in galactic affairs. Eli avoided him when possible. On a cold Tuesday morning, or what passed for Tuesday on an orbital station with no real sun, the cadets filed into the largest lecture hall on the station for their advanced xenothreat analysis course. The room was built like an amphitheater, with curved rows of seats descending toward a central platform where a massive holographic projector hummed softly. The instructor was already waiting. His name was Vorath Sen, and he was a Druvani, a species known for their 4 arms, their silver-white skin, and their unsettlingly calm demeanor even in the most violent situations. Sen was old, older than anyone could confirm, and he carried himself with the quiet weight of someone who had seen more death than most species had words for. He had fought in 3 interstellar wars and survived them all. When Sen spoke, people listened, not because he was loud, but because he was the kind of quiet that made you lean forward. "Today," Sen began, his deep voice rolling through the hall like distant thunder, "we discuss the thing that keeps admirals awake at night and makes war councils go silent." He pressed a control on the podium, and the lights dimmed. The holographic projector activated and filled the center of the room with an image that made several cadets gasp. It was a reconstruction, a historical recording pieced together from fragments of sensor data recovered from dead ships and dying worlds. It showed a thing. There was no better word for it. A massive, shifting, writhing entity the size of a small moon, constantly changing shape, crackling with stolen energy, trailing the wreckage of entire fleets behind it like a cape made of debris and death. "This," Sen said calmly, "is the Wraith Sovereign." The room was absolutely silent. Sen let the image rotate slowly as he spoke. He explained that the Wraith Sovereign was believed to be a remnant weapon from a precursor civilization that had vanished millions of years ago, a biomechanical apex predator designed to consume energy, matter, and information, and adapt to any threat it encountered. 300 years ago, it had awakened from dormancy in the Corvin Nebula, and carved a path of annihilation through the Veshan hegemony. Systems, billions of lives, an entire civilization erased in less than a standard year. Sen listed the weapons that had been used against it. Antimatter warheads, absorbed. Singularity lances, deflected. Psionic disruptors, ignored. Planet-cracking siege cannons. The Sovereign had adapted to the energy frequency mid-impact, and turned the weapon's own output back against the fleet that fired it. Every weapon, every strategy, every desperate gambit had failed. The Sovereign had eventually returned to dormancy on its own, retreating into the nebula for reasons no one understood. And the galaxy had spent the last 3 centuries praying it would never wake up again. Sen paused the hologram and looked out at his students. His forearms were folded behind his back, and his silver eyes moved slowly across the rows of young faces, frightened faces, awed faces, faces trying very hard to look brave. "The Wraith Sovereign," Sen stated, and his voice carried the absolute certainty of someone who believed this in his bones. "Your only objective, should you ever encounter it, is to run." Sorvan nodded solemnly in the front row, his jaw tight, his clawed hands gripping his knees. Tyrus was trembling beside Eli, their wings buzzing faintly with involuntary anxiety. Eli sat in the back row and did something no one else in the room did. He tilted his head. It was a small gesture, barely noticeable, the kind of thing a person does when they hear something that does not quite fit the shape of the world as they understand it. He opened his personal datapad under the desk, his fingers moving with quiet practice speed, and he began downloading the full technical readout of the Wraith Sovereign's adaptive capabilities. Every sensor log, every weapons analysis, every failed countermeasure report that the Academy's classified database had on file did not look afraid. He looked interested. At the front of the hall, Instructor Sen was wrapping up his lecture, but something made him glance toward the back row. His silver eyes found the human cadet sitting alone in the dim light, head tilted, datapad glowing, and for a brief moment something crossed the old warrior's face. It might have been unease. It might have been recognition. It was gone before anyone else noticed, and Sen moved on. But Eli Morrow did not move on. He sat in that back row, long after the other cadets had filed out, scrolling through data, reading failure reports, studying the patterns of a thing the entire galaxy had declared invincible. And somewhere in the back of his mind, in that restless corner where humans keep the ideas that are either brilliant or insane, a thought began to take shape. In the weeks that followed the lecture, Eli Morrow disappeared. Not literally, of course. He still attended classes, still showed up for combat drills, still sat with Tyrus in the mess hall, and picked at the tasteless synthetic protein the Academy called food. But his mind was somewhere else. Anyone paying attention could see it, in the way his eyes drifted during simulations, the way he answered questions a half-second too late, the way he kept turning that little piece of scrap metal over and over in his fingers, like a man trying to solve a puzzle only he could see. Tyrus noticed first. "You have not slept in 3 days," the Kethri said one evening, their compound eyes reflecting the dim blue light of the corridor as they walked back from a navigation exam. "I slept 4 hours on Tuesday," Eli replied, without looking up from his datapad. "That was 5 days ago. Then I am overdue." Tyrus made a clicking sound with their mandibles that Eli had learned to interpret as deep frustration mixed with genuine worry. "Where do you keep going after hours?" Eli hesitated, then said, "Come with me." He led Tyrus down 6 levels to the lower engineering labs, a section of the station that most cadets did not even know existed. It had once been a maintenance bay for the station's original construction drones, but those drones had been decommissioned decades ago, and the space had been left to gather dust and silence. Eli had claimed a workbench in the far corner, and turned it into something that looked like the aftermath of an explosion at a hardware store. Disassembled sidearms lay in neat rows beside their component parts. Sheets of equations covered the wall, handwritten in black marker. Some crossed out, some circled, some connected by arrows that formed a web of logic only Eli could follow. Salvaged components from requisition orders sat in organized bins, coils, trigger assemblies, and in the center of the bench, a block of material so dense that it had actually warped the metal surface beneath it. Tyrus stared at all of it for a long, silent moment. "Eli, what is this?" Eli pulled up a stool and sat down, rubbing his eyes with the heels of his hands. Every weapon that was ever used against the Wraith Sovereign was energy-based or technologically complex, he began, his voice carrying the slightly manic quality of someone who had been thinking about one thing for too long. Antimatter warheads, energy. Singularity lances, energy. Psionic disruptors, energy with a different hat on. Planet crackers, just really big energy. He picked up his datapad and showed Tyrus the adaptive analysis data he had downloaded after Sen's lecture. The Sovereign's biology is built to counter advanced civilizations. That is literally what it was designed to do. It reads energy signatures, decodes targeting, algorithms, restructures its molecular lattice to absorb or deflect whatever hits it. And it does all of this in seconds. He set the datapad down and looked at Tyrus with eyes that were bloodshot but burning. "But what if you do not give it anything to read?" Tyrus was quiet for a moment, processing. "What do you mean?" Eli reached for the dense block of material on the bench and held it up. "This is a depleted neutronium microslug. It is the densest stable material I could get my hands on without triggering a security flag. One slug, about the size of my thumbnail, weighs roughly 40 kilograms. He set it down with a heavy thunk that rattled the tools on the bench. "I am building a kinetic mass driver, a railgun basically, but stripped down to the absolute minimum. No targeting computer, no energy-based firing mechanism, no electronic components in the projectile. Just magnetic coils to accelerate the slug and a manual trigger to fire." He gestured at the half-assembled device on the bench, a bulky, ugly thing made of welded metal and exposed wiring, with iron sights bolted to the top, like something out of a history museum. "The slug has no energy signature, no programming, no data of any kind. It is just mass, very dense mass, moving at a very high velocity. The Sovereign has never encountered a weapon this simple, because no advanced civilization would ever build something this primitive." Tyrus stared at the weapon, then at Eli, then back at the weapon. "You think a bullet will stop something that survived a singularity lance?" Eli shook his head slowly. "No. I think it will not know what to do with it. Every weapon it has ever faced was smart. This is the dumbest thing I can possibly build. It carries zero information. There is nothing to decode, nothing to adapt to, nothing to absorb. It is just a rock going really fast." Tyrus was silent for a very long time. Cathri were a species that valued logic above all else, and Eli could see the calculations running behind those gemstone eyes. Probability assessments, risk analyses, historical comparisons, all the mental machinery of a brilliant strategic mind turning over a proposal that was either genius or complete madness. "The odds are terrible," Eli finished for them. "I know. You could be wrong about everything. I know that too. And even if you are right, you would need to get close enough to fire a manually aimed weapon at a target the size of a moon, without any technological assistance, while the most dangerous entity in galactic history tries to kill you. Yes." Tyrus clicked their mandibles again. You are insane. Probably. I am not going to talk you out of this. No. Tyrus sighed, or made the Kethri equivalent, a soft whistling exhale through their spiracles, and pulled up a second stool. Me the magnetic coil calculations, because from what I can see from here, your acceleration curve is off by at least 12%. Eli smiled for the first time in days. They worked together through the night, Tyrus correcting the math, while Eli shaped the metal. Two outsiders in a forgotten corner of the station, building something that no sane engineer would approve. Word got out, as it always does on a station full of young soldiers with too much free time and not enough privacy. Sorvan heard about it from a Gorvathi squadmate who had seen Eli hauling components down to the lower levels. The big reptilian found Eli in the mess hall the next day and stood over him with arms crossed and teeth showing in what might have been a smile or might have been a threat. I hear the human is building a weapon to fight the Wraith Sovereign, Sorvan said loudly enough for half the mess hall to hear. Conversation stopped. Heads turned. Trey. Is that true, little human? You think you can succeed where the greatest military minds in galactic history have failed? With what? A slingshot? Laughter rippled through the hall. Sorvan's squadmates, a few other cadets, even some who probably felt bad about laughing but could not help themselves. Eli held Sorvan's gaze for a moment, then looked back down at his food. Enjoy your lunch, Sorvan, he said quietly, and that was all. The laughter faded into an awkward silence, and Sorvan walked away with the vague, dissatisfied expression of someone who had expected a fight and gotten nothing. 3 days later, a classified dispatch arrived at the Academy. Long-range sensor arrays at the edge of Concord space had detected anomalous energy signatures in the Corvin Nebula, the exact region where the Wraith Sovereign had been dormant for 3 centuries. Instructor Sen read the dispatch in his private quarters, and for the first time in living memory, the old Druvani warrior looked afraid. Deep in the lower engineering lab, Eli Morrow finished the final weld on his. It was ugly, bulky and rough and covered in manual dials and mechanical switches with iron sights that looked like they belonged on a museum piece from Earth's ancient past. He loaded a single neutronium slug into the chamber, and felt the weight of it settle into the frame like a heartbeat made of metal. He set the weapon down on the workbench and stared at it. Outside the station, in the vast and silent dark, something ancient was waking up. The first sign was silence. The border monitoring station Velik 9, a small automated outpost on the edge of Concord space, sent its routine sensor ping at 0400 standard time and then simply stopped transmitting. 12 minutes later, a patrol frigate dispatched to investigate broadcast a single emergency burst, 6 words, before it too went silent. It is here, it is awake. Then the dying began. The Wraith Sovereign erupted from the Corvin Nebula like a nightmare-given form, a churning mountain of biomechanical horror that shifted and writhed and pulsed with the stolen light of every weapon that had ever been fired at it. It hit the border fleet first, 200 warships arranged in a defensive formation that had been drilled and tested and refined over decades of preparation for exactly this scenario. The formation lasted 6 minutes. The Sovereign did not fight the fleet the way one army fights another. Maneuver for position. It simply moved through them like a hand passing through smoke, consuming ships whole, absorbing their energy signatures and shield harmonics and weapons data, growing larger and more complex with every vessel it devoured. Admirals screamed orders. Captains fired everything they had. Crews watched in horror as their most powerful weapons splashed against the Sovereign's surface and were drunken like water into sand. When it was over, the border fleet was gone, and the Wraith Sovereign was 15% larger than it had been 6 minutes earlier. The Galactic Concord's Supreme Command issued the order that had been prepared 3 centuries ago, and hoped never to be used: full strategic retreat across all sectors in the Sovereign's projected path. Evacuation protocols activated on 40 worlds. Billions of beings began the desperate scramble to flee. Transport ships launched in swarms, FTL lanes clogged with traffic. Comm channels overflowed with panic and prayer. On Thalrix Prime, Instructor Voraf Sen stood in the station's command center and watched the tactical display with all four hands clasped behind his back. The Wraith Sovereign's trajectory was projected as a glowing red line cutting through the star map, and that line passed directly through the space where Thalrix Prime currently orbited. The station's chief engineer, a small furry Melisari named Commander Brex, delivered the news that turned a crisis into a catastrophe. The FTL drives are still undergoing scheduled maintenance. We pulled the primary coupling arrays for recalibration 2 days ago. We cannot reassemble and test them in under 19 hours. Sen did not flinch. He did not raise his voice. He simply asked, "How long until the Sovereign reaches us?" 12 hours, maybe less if it accelerates. The math was simple and terrible. Thalrix Prime housed 32,000 souls. Instructors, support staff, civilian families. The station had enough shuttles, escape pods, and short-range transports to evacuate most of them. But not all of them, not in 12 hours. Sen began giving orders with the calm precision of a man who had faced death before, and decided long ago that panic was a luxury he could not afford. Cadets were pulled from their quarters and organized into evacuation support teams. Every functional vessel was mobilized. Priority lists were drawn up. Children and civilians first, then non-combat personnel, then cadets, then instructors. Sorvan threw himself into the work with a ferocity that surprised everyone. The Big Gorvathi organized loading operations on 3 docking bays simultaneously, his booming voice cutting through the chaos like a blade, directing traffic and settling disputes, and physically carrying beings who were too panicked to walk on their own. Whatever arrogance he wore like armor in peacetime fell away. Crisis. And what was left underneath was a soldier, a real one. Tyrus worked the communication arrays, coordinating with incoming rescue ships and calculating optimal evacuation routes with a speed and precision that drew admiring looks from the senior officers. Their fear was still there. Eli could see it in the faint trembling of their wings, but they did not let it stop them. Eli found Instructor Sen alone in a corridor outside the command center during a brief lull in the chaos. The old Druvani was leaning against the wall with his eyes closed, and for the first time, Eli saw how tired he looked. Not just physically tired, but tired in the way that very old soldiers get when the war they thought was over comes back for one more round. "Sir," Eli said. Sen opened his eyes. Eli held up the weapon. It looked even uglier under the harsh corridor lights. A blocky, graceless thing of welded metal and mechanical switches, scarred with tool marks and smelling faintly of solder and desperation. Eli explained everything. The theory about the Sovereign's adaptive biology being designed to counter energy-based and technologically complex weapons. The logic of attacking it with something so primitive that it carried no information to decode. The neutronium slug, the manual aim, the complete absence of any electronic component. Sen listened without interrupting. His silver eyes moved from the weapon to the young human holding it, and back again. When Eli finished, the silence between them stretched like a wire pulled tight. "In 400 years of warfare," Sen said slowly, "I have never seen a weapon that could touch the Sovereign. I watched it eat civilizations. I watched it shrug off weapons that could crack planets in half. What makes you think this is different?" Eli took a breath. "Because it is not a weapon, sir. Not really. It is a rock going really fast, Eli. History has prepared it for something that stupid. Every species that fought it tried to be smarter than it, tried to outthink it, tried to build something more advanced than it. And it beat them all, because that is exactly what it was designed to counter. But nobody ever tried being dumber than it. Nobody ever threw a rock." The absurdity of the statement hung in the air between them. Sen almost laughed. Eli could see it, the faintest twitch at the corner of the Druvani's thin mouth, a crack in the ancient composure. Then the moment passed, and Sen looked at the evacuation numbers scrolling across his wrist display. The math still did not work. They needed more time. He looked back at Eli. You understand that I am sending you to die? You are sending me to buy time, sir. Whether I die doing it is a separate question. Sen studied him for a long moment. This small, fragile human, from a species the galaxy still considered children, standing in a corridor on a doomed station, holding a homemade gun, and asking permission to fly alone into the mouth of the most destructive force in known history. Take Interceptor Base 7, Sen said quietly. Single-seat, fast-attack craft. I will have the bay cleared. No escort. Any other ships will just give the Sovereign more data to absorb. Eli nodded. Cadet Morrow, sir, if by some miracle you survive this, you and I are going to have a very long conversation about unauthorized weapons construction. Looking forward to it, sir. Eli turned and walked toward the interceptor bays. The weapon was heavy in his hands, and his heart was hammering so hard he could feel it in his teeth. But his steps were steady. He was halfway to the bay when Tyrus caught up to him. The Kethri had heard. Of course they had heard. They were monitoring every communication channel on the station, and they grabbed Eli's arm with a grip that was surprisingly strong for an insectoid who claimed to hate physical contact. This is insane, Tyrus whispered, and their voice cracked on the last word. Eli looked at his friend, his best friend, the anxious, brilliant, beautiful mess of a being who had stayed up all night helping him fix magnetic coil calculations for a weapon that was probably going to get him killed. Yeah, Eli agreed, that is sort of the point. He gently pulled his arm free, climbed into the interceptor, mag-locked the weapon to the cockpit beside him, sealed the hatch, and felt the engines hum to life beneath him. The bay doors opened onto the infinite black. Somewhere out there, rushing toward them at terrible speed, the Wraith Sovereign was coming. And Eli Morrow, one human with one bullet, and no plan beyond being the dumbest thing the galaxy's greatest predator had ever encountered, launched himself into the dark to meet it. The interceptor dropped out of FTL, and Eli Morrow saw the face of something that should not exist. It filled the viewport like a second sky, a shifting, boiling mountain of biomechanical flesh and stolen metal that stretched across the black in every direction, so vast that his mind could not hold the whole shape of it at once. The Wraith Sovereign was not one thing, it was everything it had ever consumed. He could see the ghosts of warships embedded in its surface, half-digested hulls fused with organic tissue that pulsed and rippled like muscle beneath skin. He could see energy crackling across its body in arcs of blue and white, the remnants of weapons fired at it centuries ago, still being processed, still being learned from. It was beautiful in the way that a storm is beautiful, when you know it is going to kill you. Behind it trailed a field of debris that stretched for thousands of kilometers, the shattered remains of the border fleet, 200 warships, reduced to glittering dust, catching the distant starlight like a river of broken diamonds. Eli's hands were shaking. He let them shake. There was no shame in fear. The shame would be in letting fear make his decisions. The interceptor's sensors immediately began screaming. Every warning light in the cockpit flared red as the Sovereign's presence flooded the electromagnetic spectrum with noise. It was already reaching for him. Invisible tendrils of electromagnetic energy extending outward, tasting his ship's energy signature, probing his shields, beginning the process of decoding his systems. This was how it started. This was what it did to every ship it encountered. It read you like a book, learned your language, and then spoke death back to you in a voice you could not defend against. Eli had about 90 seconds before it finished reading him. He reached for the master power switch and killed everything. Shields, gone. Weapon systems, gone. Sensors, gone. Navigation, gone. Communication, gone. Even life support dropped to its absolute minimum, barely enough to keep the air breathable and the temperature above freezing. The cockpit went dark. The silence was immediate and total, the kind of silence that presses against your ears and makes you aware of your own heartbeat in a way that feels uncomfortably intimate. The interceptor was no longer a ship in any meaningful sense. It was a metal box drifting through space with a human inside it, radiating almost nothing, broadcasting almost nothing, existing as barely more than background noise against the cosmic microwave radiation. And the Wraith Sovereign hesitated. Eli watched through the viewport as the tendrils of electromagnetic energy that had been reaching for him faltered and retracted, groping blindly in the space where a target had been a moment ago, and finding almost nothing. It was like watching a predator lose the then. For perhaps the first time in its ancient existence, the Sovereign was confused. It had detected a ship. It knew something was there, but the signal had vanished so completely and so suddenly that its adaptive systems had nothing to latch onto. Eli held his breath. He was flying blind now. No sensors meant no way to track the Sovereign's movements, except through the viewport with his own two eyes. No navigation meant no way to calculate distance or velocity or approach angle. No targeting computer meant no way to aim except the iron sights bolted to the top of the ugliest weapon ever built. He was a caveman in a tin can, drifting toward a god. The Sovereign adapted. Of course it did. That was what it did. It could not find him by energy signature, so it shifted strategies, reaching out with gravitational pulses instead, using the subtle distortion of spacetime to locate objects by mass alone. Eli felt the ship shudder as the first pulse washed over him. The interceptor groaned, and the hull flexed inward slightly as gravitational forces tugged at every atom of the vessel. The Sovereign had found him again. Not precisely. Gravitational detection was blunt and imprecise compared to electromagnetic scanning, but well enough to know where he was and that he was getting closer. Tendrils of the Sovereign's body began extending toward him, massive organic cables, hundreds of meters thick, reaching out like fingers to grab and consume. Eli fired the manual attitude thrusters, tiny chemical burners with no electronic signature, and adjusted his drift, slipping between the reaching tendrils with movements that were part instinct and part desperate improvisation. He was close now, close enough that the Sovereign filled the entire viewport, close enough that he could see the surface detail, the way the biomechanical flesh rippled and shifted, the way absorbed technology glinted beneath translucent skin like bones beneath muscle, the way the whole massive organism pulsed with a slow, terrible rhythm that felt almost like breathing. And there, deep beneath the surface, visible through layers of semi-transparent tissue, he could see it. The processing core. Intelligence reports had theorized its existence, a dense nexus of neural tissue and quantum processors that served as the Sovereign's brain, the seat of its adaptive intelligence, the thing that allowed it to analyze and counter any weapon in seconds. It glowed with a faint golden light, pulsing in sync with the organism's rhythm, and it was directly ahead of him. Eli reached for the weapon. It was heavy in his hands, 40 kilograms of neutronium slug in a frame of welded metal and magnetic coils, and he had to brace it against the cockpit console to hold it steady. No targeting computer, no assisted aim, no electronic guidance of any kind, just a human, a gun, and iron sights. Eye to the sight and aligned it with the golden glow of the processing core. The Sovereign seemed to sense the danger, not through any technological detection. There was nothing to detect. But perhaps through something older, something instinctual, the way a prey animal sometimes knows it is being watched, even when it cannot see the predator. The tendrils reached faster, the gravitational pulses intensified, the hull screamed. Eli pulled the trigger. The magnetic coils fired in sequence, a purely mechanical chain reaction with no electronic control, and the neutronium slug left the barrel at a significant fraction of the speed of light. There was no beam of energy, no flash of exotic particles, no dramatic display of advanced technology. There was just a tiny piece of matter, unimaginably dense and moving unimaginably fast, crossing the gap between the interceptor and the sovereign in a fraction of a heartbeat. It carried no energy signature, programming, no data, no information of any kind. It was just mass. The Wraith Sovereign did not adapt. For the first time in its millions of years of existence, something struck it that it could not read, could not decode, could not understand. The neutronium slug hid the processing core like a needle through wet paper. Its sheer density and velocity carried it straight through layers of adaptive armor that had shrugged off planet-killing weapons, because there was nothing to adapt to. No energy frequency to match, no algorithm to counter, no signal to absorb. It was the equivalent of a creature that had evolved perfect defenses against every poison in the world being killed by a falling rock. The impact was catastrophic. The Sovereign screamed. Not in sound, there was no air to carry sound, but in a psychic shockwave that exploded outward through subspace like a detonation, a blast of pure alien anguish and confusion that hit every sentient mind within 10 light-years like a hammer. Eli felt it. A moment of contact with something ancient and vast and utterly bewildered. A mind that had never in its entire existence encountered something it could not understand, suddenly drowning in incomprehension. On Thalric's Prime, every being on the station staggered. Tyrus dropped to their knees. Sorvon caught himself against a bulkhead. Instructor Sen gripped the command console with all 4 hands and closed his eyes against the wave of alien confusion washing through his mind. And out in the black, the Wraith Sovereign came apart. Without its processing core, the vast organism lost coherence the way a puppet loses shape when you cut the strings. The unified entity that had consumed civilizations and shrugged off armadas fragmented into thousands of smaller pieces, still alive, still dangerous, but disoriented and uncoordinated, drifting apart like an empire collapsing in real time. Stopped. The shockwave hit Eli's interceptor like a wall. The tiny ship tumbled end over end. Systems that were already offline shattered. The hull cracked along 3 seams, and the cold of space began seeping in. Eli was thrown against his restraints so hard that he felt something in his chest snap. Blood filled his mouth, and his vision went white with pain. But through the cracked viewport, spinning wildly against the stars, he could see the fragments of the Sovereign drifting apart, confused, purposeless, broken. He tried to smile, but the pain turned it into a grimace. The interceptor's emergency beacon, a simple mechanical device with no electronics, just a chemical light that burned in a specific spectral pattern, activated automatically when the hull breach was detected. Somewhere behind him, Thalric's prime sensors registered the beacon, and on the command deck, Instructor Vorath Sen stared at the tactical display showing the Sovereigns. Shattered remains, spreading across space like seeds scattered by a wind, and he said nothing for a very long time. Sorvon stood behind him, his emerald scales pale, his voice barely a whisper. "Impossible," he said. Sen shook his head slowly, and when he finally spoke, his voice was quiet and strange, and full of something that might have been wonder. "No, just human," he said. Eli Morrow woke up 11 days later in a medical bay that smelled like antiseptic and warm metal. The first thing he became aware of was pain, a dull, widespread ache that radiated from his chest outward like heat from a dying fire, held at bay by whatever cocktail of alien painkillers was dripping into his arm through a tube he could not quite see. The second thing he became aware of was Tyrus. The Kethri was asleep in a chair beside the bed, their long insectoid body folded into a position that looked profoundly uncomfortable, their iridescent wings twitching faintly with whatever dreams insects had. Eli tried to speak, and managed only a dry croak that sounded like someone stepping on gravel. It was enough. Tyrus jolted awake so fast that they nearly fell out of the chair, their compound eyes going wide and catching the light like 100 tiny mirrors. For a moment, they just stared at Eli. And then they started talking very fast, in a voice that cracked between relief and fury. "You absolute fool. You ridiculous, reckless, idiotic primate. Do you have any idea what you 11 days, Eli? 11 days in a trauma pod, with 4 broken ribs, and a punctured lung, and a cracked skull, and hypothermia so severe that the doctors said your core temperature was lower than the ambient surface of a... And I sat here. I sat in this horrible chair for 11 days, because I did not know if you were going to wake up, or if I was going to have to go back to our quarters and pack up your things and send them back to Titan in a box, and explain to your family that you died because you flew a tin can at a space god with a homemade gun and..." Tyrus stopped. Their mandibles clicked once, twice, and then they leaned forward and wrapped their arms around Eli in a hug that was awkward and bony and fierce, and probably the best thing Eli had ever felt in his entire life. Whispered back. And he meant it in the moment, even though they both knew it was probably a lie. Over the next several days, as Eli healed and slowly regained his strength, he learned what had happened after he lost consciousness. The evacuation of Thalrix Prime had completed successfully during the window his attack had bought them. Every single being on the station had been moved to safety before the FTL drives were finally repaired, and the station itself jumped to a secure location. Concord battle fleets had arrived in the sector within hours of the Sovereign's fragmentation, and had begun systematically hunting down the scattered pieces. Without its processing core, the fragments were still dangerous, each one a predatory biomechanical organism capable of consuming small ships, but they were disoriented and uncoordinated, acting on instinct rather than intelligence, and the fleets were making steady progress in containing and destroying them. Over, but it was no longer existential. The galaxy had survived, and now the galaxy wanted to talk about the human who had made that possible. Eli's name was everywhere. Galactic news networks broadcast the story with breathless excitement. The cadet, the homemade weapon, the impossible shot, the scream that every sentient being within 10 light-years had felt in their minds. It was the kind of story that transcended species and culture. The kind of story that became legend before the facts had even finished settling. Songs were written in 7 languages. 3 separate species commissioned heroic statues before Eli had even left the medical bay. His image trended across the galactic net for weeks, and a Melisari children's show produced an episode about a brave little human who saved the galaxy with a very special rock. Eli found the children's show oddly flattering. But not everyone was celebrating. In the quieter corridors of power, in the diplomatic chambers, and intelligence offices, and war rooms of the Galactic Concord, a different conversation was happening. One conducted in whispers and encrypted messages, and very carefully worded formal inquiries. The conversation was about fear. Humanity had been part of the Galactic Concord for 40 years. In that time they had been regarded as clever but fragile, innovative but undisciplined, a promising young species that might eventually grow into something noteworthy if they were given enough time and guidance. That narrative was now in ruins. A single human cadet, not a scientist, not a general, not a product of some secret weapons program, had solved a problem that the combined intellects of the galaxy's oldest and most powerful civilizations had failed to solve for 300 years. And he had done it, not by being smarter or more technologically advanced. He had done it by thinking in a direction that no other species had considered. That was what frightened them. The Druvani War Council held an emergency session to discuss what they called the human variable. The observation that humans had a consistent tendency to approach problems from angles that other species found not just unexpected, but conceptually invisible. The Gorvati Diplomatic Corps formally submitted a proposal to the Concord suggesting that human weapons development be subjected to independent oversight and review. The motion was quietly tabled after Earth's ambassador pointed out with a very calm smile that the weapon in question had been built from spare parts in a maintenance closet, and that attempting to regulate human creativity was roughly as practical as attempting to regulate the weather. The motion stayed tabled, but the fear did not go away. Sorvon came to see Eli on the 6th day of his recovery. The big Gorvati stood in the doorway of the medical bay for a long moment, with his massive scaled body, his expression unreadable. Then he walked to Eli's bedside and stood at attention. He raised one clawed fist to his chest and extended it outward, a Gorvati salute, the gesture of respect given between warriors who have proven themselves in battle, a gesture that Sorvon's people did not offer lightly and never offered insincerely. He held it for 3 heartbeats. Then he lowered his fist, gave a single sharp nod, turned, and walked out without saying a word. He did not need to. Tyrus was offered a prestigious research position with the Concord's newly formed Sovereign Fragment Analysis Division, tasked with studying the scattered remains of the Wraith Sovereign to understand its biology and ensure it could never reconstitute itself. They accepted on one condition, that they be allowed to choose their own research partner. The division's director, puzzled, asked who they had in mind. Tyrus just clicked there. Mandibles. Instructor Sen came last. He arrived on the 11th day, just hours before Eli was scheduled to be discharged, and he came alone. The old Druvani pulled up a chair, the same chair Tyrus had worn a groove into over 11 days of vigil, and sat down with the careful slowness of someone whose body carried more years than it was designed for. For a while he said nothing. He just sat there with his 4 hands resting on his knees, and his silver eyes fixed on some middle distance that existed more in memory than in the room. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than Eli had ever heard it. "I was there," Sen said. 300 years ago, I was a young officer in the Veshan border guard when the Sovereign first awakened. I was 26. I thought I was invincible. He paused. I watched it consume the Veshan homeworld. 14 billion people. I was on one of the last ships to escape the system, and I watched through the rear viewport as the planet broke apart, and the pieces were drawn into that thing like food into a mouth. His 4 hands tightened on his knees. I have spent my entire life since then teaching young soldiers to run from it, because I believed, truly, completely, in every fiber of my being, that nothing could stop it. I had seen the proof. I had lived the proof. The Wraith Sovereign was invincible, and the only sane response was retreat. He looked at Eli. I was wrong, and I have never been happier to be wrong. He was quiet for a moment, and then a thin smile crossed his face. The first genuine smile Eli had ever seen on the old warrior. I told you no weapon could halt it, and technically I was correct. What you built was not a weapon by any civilized definition in the galaxy. It had no targeting system, no power source, no electronic components. It was an insult to engineering. The smile widened just slightly. Did not know what to say to that. So he said the only honest thing he could think of. Thank you for letting me try, sir. Sen nodded once, rose from the chair with the careful dignity that was as much a part of him as his silver skin, and walked to the door. He paused there and looked back. The Academy expects you back in class next week, Cadet Morrow. Do not be late. Then he was gone. Eli was discharged that afternoon. He walked through the corridors of Thalric's Prime on legs that were still shaky, past cadets who stared and whispered and stepped aside, past officers who nodded with a respect that felt strange and heavy on his shoulders, past a group of first-year students who snapped to attention as he passed, and then dissolved into excited chatter the moment he rounded the corner. He made his way down 6 levels to the lower engineering lab, to the forgotten maintenance bay with the dusty workbenches and the bad lighting that had become his second home over the past months. His workbench was just as he had left it. Sheets of equations on the wall, bins of components, tools arranged in the organized chaos that only made sense to him. And sitting in the center of the bench, placed there by someone while he was unconscious, was his weapon. It was battered and scorched, the metal warped by heat and impact, the iron sights bent at a slight angle, the magnetic coils blackened, but intact, recovered from the wreckage of his interceptor by a salvage team that had apparently decided it was worth saving. Beside it, someone had placed a small metal plaque. Eli picked it up and read the words engraved on its surface. The dumbest weapon in the galaxy, Cadet Eli Morrow, class of 2347. Sometimes the simplest answer is the right one. He did not know who had made it. He suspected Tyrus, though the metalwork was too clean for Kethri hands, and the lettering had a formal precision that suggested Gorvathi craftsmanship. Maybe it had been both of them. Eli set the plaque down and picked up the weapon, turning it over in his hands one last time, feeling the weight of it, the roughness of it, the beautiful, ugly stubbornness of it. Then he set it back on the bench, right next to the plaque, where it belonged. He stood there for a moment in the quiet of the lab, alone with the hum of the station and the distant stars visible through a small viewport in the far wall. Then Eli Morrow picked up a wrench, pulled a fresh sheet of metal toward him, and started building something new.